Hi, good evening again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series as we're looking at profiling some of the lawyer and paralegal bencher candidates. As always, the opinions and views are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trials College, or any of the education institutions or organizations that I'm affiliated with. And our final speaker here for the evening today is Heather. And Heather, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. And perhaps maybe you can do a quick introduction, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. So my name is Heather Hansen. I'm a family law lawyer. I practice across the province in not all of the courthouses, but many courthouses across the province and mostly in the GTA. A sort of neat feature of my practice is that there's a lot of variety in family law in terms of how people practice and the areas they practice. I've been very fortunate that my career has had a pretty heavy litigation focus for a family lawyer. There's lots of family lawyers who don't spend as much time in the courtroom, but I've been fortunate to do that. And so I've had lots of interaction with sort of the day-to-day workings of the justice system. A lot, criminalists have a sort of similar experience in terms of being on the ground in the courtrooms on a pretty regular basis. So that's sort of what my practice has looked like over the years. I'm a certified specialist by the Law Society, and I practice in all areas of family law. Another part of my career is that the year that I was called to the bar, my partner, Martha McCarthy, founded her law firm, Martha McCarthy and Company, and I took off my robes on the day I was called to the bar, went to lunch, and then hung them up in the office and started on the next day. And so the year that the firm was started was my first year of practice. So I've grown up in practice alongside of this really great opportunity of growing a business alongside that. We're now a 20 plus law firm. The firm's name is McCarthy Hansen and Company. And, we employ, somewhere to between 50 and 60 people, and we've grown over the years. And so I've seen the business side of practice, and that's been a really cool part of my job as well. I have two kids, a 9 and 11-year-old. They go to school in downtown Toronto. I have a husband who's a lawyer. I love the profession. I love the work. I was a Windsor Law grad. I grew up in southwestern Ontario in a mostly farming community. And yeah, that's pretty much who I am and what I do. Another thing that I talk about a lot and I'm really proud of is that as part of my career, I've spent a lot of time working on improving technological competence in the practice. So I was an early adopter and somebody who did a lot of electronic hearings well before COVID. I always date stamp it to my son, my daughter, pardon me, who's turning 10, because I started sort of practicing electronically just when I came back from a mat leave with her. And so I've been doing it for a decade. And that's been a big part of my career, and a really fun part of practice is learning how to, improve access to justice through technology. I've run trials and I've taught a lot in that area. So that's also been like a part of my career that's been really fun and a really interesting part of being a lawyer. There's much more, I'm sure, much more to being a lawyer than just being a lawyer.
Yeah, so I mean, you love the law and the legal profession so much. Now you want to serve as a bencher if you're
Yeah.
elected. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why you made that decision.
Yeah, so sure thing. I will say at the outset, it definitely wasn't part of my plan. I had a pretty basic understanding of the goings on in convocation over the last 4 years. I wasn't particularly engaged in the specific issues, but like many of us, I've been sort of increasingly aware and troubled and wanting to figure out where I sit in the community at large and how I sit in terms of my values and beliefs and the political rhetoric we see in the larger community. It's something that's really been on my mind over the last 4 years. And I did not, although I didn't know a ton about what was going on day to day in convocation, I certainly was alive to sort of these big issues that we've all heard of, and they were becoming increasingly worrisome. And the biggest one that we all know is that there was such division in the last convocation around the statement of principles and the rise of this group who chose to make that sort of the issue in convocation. And so when this election came around, I I was really thinking hard about who I was as a lawyer, what I cared about, and I thought it was time. And it wasn't so much about my personal views on specific issues. It was really about wanting to put myself out there as a candidate who is invested in nothing more and nothing less than just making sure that the Law Society serves the public and serves its lawyer members, and not making it a bigger thing. I wanted to be a candidate who could offer that in a genuine way. And, thankfully, a lot of the members of the Good Governance Coalition are aligned in that objective. So that's how I found my way into this election. Again, I'm running a law firm. I've got young kids. I have a busy practice. It wasn't quite the age and stage that I was planning on it, but it really jumped up at me. And again, with this larger sort of question we're all asking ourselves about, where do we fit in terms of how we have civic responsibility? How do we participate in our community? Where do we add value? It just felt like a time where I could add some value, and that's what I'm hoping to do this election, and if elected as a bencher.
Now you point out, I mean, I guess for the Good Governance Coalition in terms of some shared values, and part of it, I mean, you're pointing to the last 4 years, and where the Stop SOP group, as it was then, came in, they were elected, and first they got rid of the statement of principles, and then now in response, you have the Good Governance Coalition that's essentially saying, their slate is bad, but our slate is good. And if we're elected, then we're going to get rid of this idea or look to explore electoral reform altogether. But then how can sort of the lawyers that are voting trust you that that in fact is going to happen, and you're not just going to swing the pendulum all the way to the other side and do all the things as a group in response to what may have been happening in the last 4 years? So maybe you can kind of reconcile that for me.
Yeah, let me break that down, if I might, into sort of three sub bites. The first is just this the question, right? The primary question about how can you say that there's a problem with an organization or a group of professionals coming together, and then you forming a group of professionals, and we have this collision, but you say that's bad. So how does that work? And I think that's fair. And what I've been saying to people we're halfway down the mountain in the middle of an avalanche. Like, that's what we are right now, right? And so this avalanche and the momentum started in the last election, and what we saw, and I know many of my colleagues have spoken about the numbers, so I'm not going to do that right now, but the reality is that by making a conscious choice to create a slate in the last election, and now in addition to creating it, spending 4 years voting in that aligned way, the Good Governance Coalition is formed for the purposes of giving a clear alternate choice of candidates. We don't want to have a watered down cohort. We want there to be clear communication to the voters about what the choices are, and that's the core difference. And the problem, unfortunately, is a problem we can't solve for this election without taking the step, in our view, and the step is to form a group of qualified professional candidates who are like-minded philosophically, not on issues, but philosophically. And that leads to the second point that I wanted to break down. And this is one of the core distinctions between, there's sort of two, in my view, core distinctions between the Good Governance Coalition and the Full Stop slate. And they are this: when you look at the identified mandate of the Full Stop slate, the Stop Woke, Stop Creep mandate, okay, it is singularly focused on the interests of the lawyers in the legal profession, right? Like, that's like when they talk about the things that they're worried about, the mandate, the concern, and many of those concerns, even though we might substantively disagree with them, that's only half or part of the mandate of benchers, right? Like, we have to remember that the mandate of the Law Society and of Benchers and Convocation is to serve the public, right? Like, we're custodians in the public interest, not just representing the constituents in the legal community, right? And so, when you talk about sort of the things and the values that are important to the Good Governance Coalition, you'll hear from people like me and from my colleagues, we care about public confidence, we care about access to justice, we care about diversity and inclusion, we care about making sure that the Law Society is functional for the public, not just for the lawyers who are practicing within it. And that is not to the exclusion, to be clear, of making sure that lawyers like me, small firm lawyers, medium firm lawyers, are getting a functional convocation in a functional law society. But there's a distinction in the sense that the full stop slate is really focused on kind of their individual interests as lawyers. And one of my concerns is that really takes away from sort of the dual obligations that a bencher should have. The other piece to that, and then I'll stop talking, is I could go on a long time about this. The other piece is this idea of, and it is a leap of faith in the sense that I understand why voters would be skeptical or would take a pause when I say this, but the full stop slate has a record from the last election of voting in a slate and taking positions that are political and not based on the individual issues. And the mandate for us, as I understand it, although I've not sat in convocation yet, as I understand it, and as my fellow, like my incumbent candidates have explained and educated us, is to look at the issues, to consider them in the context of the public interest and the interest of the legal community, and then to make individual informed decisions based on your own information. And every member of the Good Governance Coalition has committed to that. That's part of the commitment we make. We've made, for example, a commitment that not only individually, but collectively, nobody on the coalition is moving to reintroduce the statement of principles, for example. That's a rhetoric line. But the commitment by the Good Governance Coalition to not vote en masse or not act as a party after the election is a commitment. And that's a commitment that we've represented to the community. And we don't have that commitment from the other group. And in fact, we have a track record that suggests the opposite. So that, I think those are some sort of core distinctions between our respective positions on the individual. And then the last thing I wanted to say is on the individual issues. You know, I've heard and I've listened to a lot of the stuff that many of the slate members have said. And, you know, in a different world, there's space for healthy debate on many of the issues that they raise, right? Like there's lots of reasons that we need to have those issues raised, many of them, for example, fees and access to resources for small and sole practitioners. And there's lots of things that they talk about that are fair, but they belong in a respectful forum that's free from discrimination, generalizations, or politicization. And so that's, you know, it's not that we disagree with every single issue. It's about wanting to return to a forum of decorum and a forum where we can debate these issues in a way more consistent with our dual obligations, not just the obligations to the lawyers.
I mean, let's look at that in terms of, I mean, it also works with, you know, the rest of the full stop group, right? I mean, I don't necessarily have the numbers in front of me, but you know, they could say, well, you point to this track record, but that's of, let's say 12 or of the 22 from then, and now of our group of 35, you know, we have, you know, more than half of us are brand new. So how are we painted with the same brush? The same way that, you know, you're going to say, hey, I'm brand new, JP. I wasn't an incumbent bencher. I wasn't even a previous bencher. So I'm bringing unique thought to the table. Don't judge me based on the prior good governance bencher candidates that were previous benchers, that we're going to kind of all vote the same and take a leap of faith that way. So doesn't that kind of cut both ways, that perhaps, you know, the importance of having this discussion with some of the full stop members that are running for the first time could in fact be brought to convocation, where we can have a healthy debate about all those issues you just pointed out.
I think that's fair. The observation I would make in response to that comment is the distinction is they haven't said that, right? Like that's the core distinction. Like, you know, the voters know through our communication, through what individual candidates have said, through what our commitments are in the coalition, that that's not what we're going to do. And there is a track record and a history, and even I would go as far as to suggest that even in their narrative, right? Like when you listen to what their position is, right? When they talk about the things that they're going to stop, and stop creep, and stop woke, and stop bloat, right? Like they actually are, they're they're campaigning on issues, right? Like that is what they're doing. And the Good Governance Coalition is campaigning on serving the public, returning to good governance, ensuring healthy debate, and ensuring that we have a convocation where there's a diversity of opinion. And that is there is a difference in the substantive platforms. And of course, each individual candidate in the Good Governance Coalition has individual issues, but our platform isn't about issues. It's about, again, philosophy, which is a really important distinction in this election.
Now, you brought up issues and individual issues. So perhaps we can share some of the issues that are concerning you. And if you're elected, that you're going to bring to the table to have this discussion. And however the votes would go, I mean, they go. But what would you like to kind of bring to the conversation?
So a few things. First of all, I have a website, heatherforbencher.com. You can check it out. I've sort of laid out in a bit more detail some of the issues that are important to me as a family lawyer, but not just as a family lawyer, as somebody who spends a lot of time in courthouses. You know, I am focused and I care deeply about not just like what we call access to justice, but like public confidence in the system, right? And that's about communication. That's about when litigants are engaged in the system, they have confidence in the process and the institutions and the practitioners within it. That is, in my view, after years of doing this, bound up with family law reform, because we can't have public confidence in the system where the place where people have the most challenging interactions with the system isn't functioning, right? So family law reform and continuing to make that a priority in terms of initiatives, policies, continuing education at the Law Society level, and making sure that the Law Society plays an active role in having sort of a pulse, like their finger on the pulse of making sure that family law reform is at the front end of many of their mandates is a big, big issue for me. Again, bound up in that without getting into too many details on this chat. The question of licensing paralegals is an issue that will be up for review in this convocation, because the licensing process was recently passed and there's an agreement for there to be a review in 3 years. So this convocation will be actively dealing with that issue. I think it's imperative that we have family law practitioners who can work with the stakeholders, work with the paralegals, try to understand the issues and really examine what this 3-year window, this is the first time where we're going to have a licensing process. So having experienced family lawyers, experienced in litigation, experienced in working in the courtrooms and seeing how self-represented litigants are suffering in litigation and how paralegals may play a role in that is really a core issue for me. As I mentioned at the beginning, I really love and really care, and I just mean that like that's just who I am. I really love and I really care about improving lawyers' competency in the area of technology. It's a really hard issue for many lawyers. It can be an access issue from a financial perspective. It can be a learning curve issue. It's a hard issue. Judges are working really hard with case lines and trying to figure it out, but there's so much work to be done. And I think that the Law Society, as an educator and a regulator, has a competence evaluator, has a lot to do to make sure that that happens. And my track record in terms of working and being a leader in that well before COVID, I think I can bring a lot to that conversation. And then the last piece is, I sometimes say to people that our law firm's like the young adult. We're like not the gangly teenager anymore. We're like a young adult law firm. We're just like a young firm that's sort of just starting to find our way in the profession. But as a business owner, I've made a lot of mistakes. Martha and I, when we've learned a lot through doing and learning and growing and shrinking and then growing again. And bringing that perspective as somebody who's running and growing a business in a highly regulated profession, I think is really important. When we hear about the anti-Bay Street, which I'm not on Bay Street, but I love Bay Street. I love not Bay Street. I don't even know where I sit in all that. I'm somewhere in between a little bit. But one of the very legitimate concerns when people say no Bay Street or anti-Bay Street is that a lot of people who work in that big world don't understand, or they can't relate to the day-to-day challenges of running a business or cash flow or expenses or, things like just even the small example, the identity verification issue that cropped up last year at the end of last year for small firm lawyers. So I'd like to be a leader in that conversation. And again, I'd like to be a leader in that conversation, not from an agenda-based perspective, but from somebody who comes to it with experience instead of coming to it with like preconceived ideas.
So let's try to unpack each one of those points there.
Yeah.
Certainly, I mean, I teach paralegal students. I've talked to some of the Good Governance Coalition group of paralegals and the scope for paralegals, not just family law, but I mean, since you have that familiarity with the reform that you're talking about, I mean, any thought there in terms of kind of how paralegals should play a role? I mean, because on one hand, obviously, you have concerns of access to justice, right? The self-represented parties that are growing in the family courts, and then that in turn delays things, which then creates further issues. And then on the other hand, from a perspective of what competence, right, in terms of getting into a new area that you may not necessarily have, right? I mean, it's kind of the balance, right? Of we need to better improve in terms of representation, but we also want to make sure, whether it's lawyers or paralegals, right, that they're getting competent representation, because then that's not really in the interest of access to justice. If everyone, whether lawyer or paralegal, is just bungling things up, then it's actually worse because you think you have competence. You're hiring a lawyer, you're hiring a licensee or paralegal. Now you're expecting people to know what to do.
Yeah. And then there's a third piece to it, like to the problem, if we're just like identifying all the problems, and then I can talk a bit more about my thoughts on the issue. The third piece, which is a big one, is that, by simply, expanding the service providers to meet the needs of a cohort of people who are being serviced, what we're really doing is we're offloading the positive obligation on the government to ensure more judicial resources, more legal aid funding, right? Like by creating just like a market-driven supply of like paralegals, what we're doing is we're like letting the government off easy on a really important family law reform, including for example, increased legal aid funding for family law cases. So those are all the problems. And I don't have like some linear solution. I am glad to see that the motion passed and that we do have a plan for the next 3 years. I'm glad to see that Convocation was able to pass that and move that forward. And what I hope is that over these 3 years, we're going to get some empirical data about how it's being taken up and what's happening. And then we're going to have to take a good hard look. What I think in response to the other part of your question about the competence issue. So that's like, what do I think? I think that I think there's a role. I think we have to be careful about what that role is in the context of, again, ensuring that we hold everyone accountable to ensuring that, for example, in family law, the resources are there and we're not, again, just creating another market-based solution. But I really am hoping that I'll be part of that conversation at the time of the review, because I think there's a lot of work to be done, including, as I said, looking at the data of what comes out of the next 3 years. On the competency point, it's a tough one, right? Like it's a really, really difficult, and I really understand both sides of the argument, and we can take that argument and like make it bigger and bigger, right? Like what can a paralegal advise on that a lawyer can't? What couldn't they? Whatever. And although it's not the same, we see, for example, in healthcare, the really invaluable role of nurse practitioners and the evolution of that role. And there's the reality is that there's a space in the market, and we have to figure out the right way that space is going to get filled. But there's a need, and the need is people, like when we're talking about what people need and what is competence, what a lot of single moms who are trying to get child support need? They need someone to help them fill out their financial statement. And that's a form. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not diluting that we need to understand the law and we all need to, like, there's going to have to be a framework. But some mom with 3 kids, she actually just needs someone to help her do the form and fill out the form and put it in. And like, that's a segment of the community, but that segment is screaming for help and attention. And we need to figure out a way. And again, that's bound up with public confidence. We can't just keep saying it's not going to work. It's not going to work. We have to start experimenting and considering ways to fill that need, because what I come back to over and over again is we know the need exists, right? Like we know it's not going away. The problem's not going away. So we have to start looking at solutions.
Now, in terms of, you brought up competence, and before we were looking at technological competence and, AI and all sorts of advancements. And again, the same thing is, well, are we as, members of the law society as lawyers and paralegals and other licensees. I know, what do we need to do to better equip ourselves, and what should the law society's role be in that?
So I think it's impossible for us as practitioners to not acknowledge at this point that our competency is bound up in your ability to manage technology, both inside and outside the courtroom. It's an issue of service to your clients. It's a service, like your duty to the court, to like under our obligations. So there's no question that we're still in the aftershocks of COVID, right? People are still freaking out about uploading documents onto case lines. It's very new, right? Like in the lifespan of our legal system, case lines is really new, guys, right? And so, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how we navigate that, we meet the needs of people. And it's really important to remember that people come to everything in life, but especially something new and challenging, with a ton of different personal experiences, right? And the question of how people use technology and how they learn to use technology, the Law Society is going to have to play a big role in that over the next 3 to 5 years, because again, I think we all still have whiplash from the transition, or some of us, many of us have whiplash, and so it's going to have to be at the forefront. And I think there's a lot of ways that aren't creep or bloat that we can do that. I don't have a tech department with a tech guy. I learned how to run trials on my iPad, and then when I wanted to learn how to use case lines, I YouTubed it. I didn't go to some seminar. I didn't have time. I YouTubed how to tag things, and then I learned how to tag things. And I think that a bit of a spirit of willingness and open-mindedness, that's what I used to say to people before COVID when I was talking about technology, is just lawyers are very clever people. We're very, very smart, right? And we can be very creative if we try, and we're excellent problem solvers. So technology doesn't have to be this complicated thing, but I definitely think that the Law Society needs to sort of be pushing lawyers in a positive, accessible way to this being the new way, because our judges need it too, right? Like, our judges need us to be leaders. They can't be the leaders. They have too much on their plate. Like, we're private citizens earning money, doing really great jobs, and the judges need us to step up in that regard also. So I think the Law Society plays a role in it from that perspective as well.
Now, I mean, going from sort of the experienced judges all the way to the other end,
Yeah.
I have students that are listening and looking to jump into the profession. And what words of wisdom or what advice would you have as they look to get started in their legal careers?
Well, so first of all, our firm, like we've had a student program since the firm started, and we've had dozens and dozens of students grow up through our firm and graduate as alumni and cycle in and stay with us. And for anyone who's listening who's a student, welcome in advance to the profession. You should always reach out to lawyers in the bar. This is a great, wonderful area to be in, and I hope that your journey is a positive one, but it won't be a journey without challenges. There's no question that this is a challenging profession with a lot of rigor, we'll call it rigor. And so my advice to people who are listening, who are students, is and it's advice I received from a woman mentor of mine, a dear friend of mine, like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is a wonderful profession, but it's a profession that you learn through doing, learn through seeing, and learn through staying. And that is something that requires you to engage in the community. It requires you to be brave. And it requires you to be really committed in those first 5 years of practice, and to know that it's a long road. And anything worth doing, any of these professions that have a very technical or substantive element to them on the front end of your career, you're going to get through that and get to the other side. And there's so many wonderful things about this profession. And I mean that sincerely. And I hope that people who are listening are inspired and who want to participate, because, as I said, one of the things I love, family law, I love the courtroom, like, I love all that, but I also love working with my colleagues and building a business. And I love that part. I love going to CPDs and talking to other people. I love talking to one of my best friends is a criminal lawyer. I like talking about her practice. Like, there's so many pieces to this that are a wonderful wonderful area to be in. And so I hope that just like anything in life, you grab it and you run with it, because it's worth doing for sure.
Now, Heather, final question. You mentioned colleagues and the
Mm-hmm,
profession there. So there's some of our colleagues may be listening to this,
mm-hmm,
and they may be thinking of who should I be voting for
yeah.
next month when the elections start.
Mm-hmm.
So why should they cast one of their votes for you?
Well, they should definitely vote for me for many of the reasons we've talked about. I hope that I can, just send a message of optimism and enthusiasm too, right? Like, you should vote for me for all of the reasons that I've talked about in terms of the issues I care about and my experience. But I also just want to change the way we talk about this, right? Like, let's just change the narrative. Let's get back to loving our profession. Let's get back to doing better and working hard. And that's been like a bit of a philosophy of mine throughout my career. And again, not like there's not some really terrible moments and lots of crying in cars and courtroom parking lots and lots of hard times, but I want us to be we can be active agents in changing how people talk about this profession and changing how we interact with it. And I want to be a candidate who's a leader in that. So that's why I hope you vote for me. But alongside me, it's so important this year that you take the time to look carefully at the quality of the qualifications of the other members of the Good Governance Coalition. I don't think there will be a moment in my career where I'm surrounded by such a tremendous cohort of leaders, engaged in the community, diverse backgrounds, tons of experience, tons of regional diversity, gender, racialized considerations. There's a huge amount of time, energy, and care that has come together to give the voters a clear choice of a group of lawyers who will hopefully be elected, and who will be able to return convocation to what it's supposed to be.
Perfect. So once again, Heather, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us, and thanks for
Thanks
everyone
for
for tuning
having
in.
me.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.